Live in the room. We are live on Facebook, I think. Let me just double check that I haven't done anything ridiculous to that. Okay, Facebook are in the room, and right, we're good. Right. So that's still got Cheryl doing that. So okay, there is a gap. There is a gap in Facebook, but right, we're here.
Everyone, they call this the human-machine interface. That a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, Robert.
I am the weakest link. Right.
You want to strengthen the train, you need more. You need to drink iron brew, don't you?
I think that's exactly.
Which actually amazingly doesn't contain iron these days.
Doesn't brew much either, to be fair. But there we go. Right. Dr. Dave. Professor
Hello.
Jones, OBE, I've not seen you in ages.
No, not in ages.
What have you been up to this week?
Well, I was at the PBC Summit in Edinburgh, which I have to say was absolutely brilliant. And for those of you who think this is a different background for Robert, that's because he's still at the summit meeting, which we've been organising over the last few days, which is to bring together the medical advisors, the patient support team, the international patient groups and industry to talk about where we are with PBC and, more importantly, where we need to go and how do we collectively work on all of that. And so different groups have been at different parts of the meeting. So the medical advisors were there for 2 days and just really brilliant conversations. And I think a sense of common purpose, a sense of people really being heard, and a real desire to work together. And today is a day involving the industry partners because they're critical. I was talking to a colleague this morning and I was talking about whether people like working with industry, and he said, but that's where drugs come from. And he's, of course, absolutely right. So it's been a wonderful occasion and much more will be heard from it. And I think it's all about setting the agenda in PBC as we move forward. So I enjoyed that immensely. And it was really interesting, Rob. I've got to tell you this. So I've got a very old soft top car. It's a very old one. It's not worth any money. But on a very nice day, you can have the top down. It's very lovely. So I drove back from Edinburgh in glorious sunlight. And it was just lovely going down the A696 across the Cheviots. And I went into over the border into England. It started raining. And it's the reverse way around. Normally you would expect it the other way around. But it was glorious. I had to stop and put the hood up because it was raining once I got into England. There you go.
So such luxury. So I've actually got an old soft top.
Yeah.
Which doesn't come down.
Okay. No, well, I don't think I'm very far away from that, actually.
Right.
It's I have the sort of car where you don't fill it with petrol, fully with petrol when it goes for its MOT. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I'm with you.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. We are live in the room. We've actually been recording that stuff, but that's fine.
Yeah. But
yeah. Right. Thank you so much. I know you've given so much time to the foundation this week.
Pleasure.
Immensely grateful and unfortunate. And you're right. We have done incredible things, but this is the fire that's been lit. This is a spark, and it's now up to us to
just for everybody on the call, so many times the experience that we all pick up. So pretty much all of the people who do these sessions were there at the meeting. The things that come out in these conversations, the sort of sentiments and issues cropped up again and again and again. So I think one of the things that we hope people find this useful. We certainly find it enjoyable. People are very kind and say that it's useful, but the collected experience of what people tell us is influencing what companies do and what regulators do. So these conversations, we learn something, we pick something up, we collect that information. That has all been fed back. And I think that's incredibly influential. So every person who's put a question in one of these sessions, that their concerns and thoughts are feeding into shaping the agenda in PBC.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Robert?
Absolutely, 100%. That's an enormously fair comment, and it's been an incredible thing to see. So, for example, one of the examples of this, so we've brought in independent facilitators who are driving the bus and just making sure that everything's done. Okay, so that means that Dave can be an independent participator and not chairing the meeting. We, and I say we as in Mo, Cheryl, myself, as members of the patient services team, can be independent participators and not necessarily, so we can actually be much more involved. And there was one bit where you separated into two groups. The first group was all about the patient experience. And the second group was about the challenges in the world of regulatory arena. And everybody self-selected the point of interest. And there were 4 tables working on the patient experience and 1 working on the regulatory experience. Now, these are clinicians, patient advocates, and industry partners who all have a vested interest in working on the patient side of things, and it was just a beautiful moment to watch that and to see people self-select into what needed to be done. So that was amazing. So there you go. So, we are here to answer your questions. I promise we will get that started now. But I think it was really important to give you an update of what we're doing, because, we've had a lot of social, we've been sharing things on social media and all of that kind of stuff. So I think it's just nice to share a little of what we're doing and just give you an idea that we're working really hard, not just us at the foundation, not just Dave and the clinical teams, but actually all of us as a collective. So Dave, thank you for addressing that and bringing that up.
No.
Right. Shall we do some Q&A? You in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my cholesterol was 8.5 in January. I brought it down to 5.5 this week. My cholesterol has gone up and down over the last few years. I'd rather not take a tablet for this that my endocrinologist is recommending that I do. Do you think this could be related to my PBC? And then I'm going to add the additional question of what can be done to help.
Yeah, okay. So for sure is the short answer, is that cholesterol is almost never normal in PBC patients. And the reason it isn't is that the process by which cholesterol is manufactured and used by the liver is implicated in PBC in a very simple way, which is one of the things that the body converts cholesterol into is what are called bile acids. And they are produced by the liver. They go out into the bile, into the gut, and they help you absorb fat. So they act like a detergent to help solubilize fat. So the body turns cholesterol into bile acids. Bile acids go out into the bile duct, then into the gut, and they are there to help you absorb fat. And if you don't have bile acids, then people produce very sort of fatty stools and actually can lose weight quite a lot. Now, bile acids are really at the heart of PBC. So you get abnormality in bile acid production, and they don't get out into the bile duct. And the bile acids that aren't really being cleared are irritant and cause some of the damage in the liver. So bile acids, the wrong bile acids in the wrong place at the wrong amounts are really one of the key parts in PBC. The point, though, is that the cholesterol that doesn't get turned into bile acid stays as cholesterol. And so that's why in simple terms, why your cholesterol goes up. Now, your cholesterol value is not in itself anything harmful, okay? So cholesterol's essential for life, and it itself in isolation is not a problem. It's what it could cause that is the worry, and it can contribute to people developing heart disease. So on average, there's a very famous study called the Framingham study, which was done in a small town in North America, where they looked at everybody in a town, and I think followed them up for 40 years or something, and looked at what happened to people and what was different about those people 20 years before, if you like. So it's a really unique study that follows people up over time. And it's one of the studies that showed that smoking gave you heart disease. Okay, so that's how do you know smoking causes heart disease? We all know that, but actually it came from studies like that. But they also showed that high cholesterol on average was associated with a higher risk of heart disease. When you drill down into it, it's only certain sorts of cholesterol, and people will be familiar with the concept of good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And that's an oversimplification, but it's actually quite useful. And the really key thing to say is that in PBC, the elevation in cholesterol is typically good cholesterol. Okay, it's good cholesterol. It's actually cholesterol it's a form of cholesterol being taken out from the blood vessels. So cholesterol elevation in PBC is almost always benign. It's not the dangerous sort of cholesterol raise. And that goes along with the fact that heart disease is actually very uncommon in PBC patients, actually more uncommon than it should be. So there is no heart disease risk with PBC at all. Now, the caveat to that is that there are people who've got an elevated cholesterol for entirely other reasons who can also get PBC. So you do need to just think about it a little bit. So what we always suggest to people is do what you call a cholesterol split. So they can actually essentially measure basically the good cholesterol and the bad cholesterol, right? And it's only if the bad cholesterol is elevated that you need treatment. So clearly, if the cholesterol's down to 5.5, that's good. 8 and a bit is too high. But what they really need to do is to do a cholesterol split and work out if there is elevation, is it the good cholesterol or bad cholesterol? What we do know is that cholesterol lowering treatments are fine in PBC. So we use a lot of fibrates, which are the older ones, but we also use those for the disease. But also people can take statins without any problems. One of the questions the doctor will ask is about heart disease risk in the family. So has anybody else had high cholesterol? Anybody else had heart disease? Also things like have you got high blood pressure? Because that's associated with it. So if there is a heart disease risk at those sorts of values because of you and the family and so on, then it's probably worth treating it. But the number on its own, no, because of the nature of PBC. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
And just one of the things to say is that everyone says that if your cholesterol's high, you must follow a rigorous diet, and that will bring your cholesterol down. But most of the cholesterol in your blood is actually made by the liver. It's not what you've eaten in your diet. And so you can lower it a little bit by stripping cholesterol out of your diet. But we shouldn't kind of blame people who can't control their cholesterol by their diet, because most of it is made by the liver. It's not what you absorb. And that's what statins do. Statins stop the pathway to making cholesterol, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. That's helpful. All right. Next question. Yesterday, I had a diagnosis of osteoporosis following a bone density scan.
Yeah.
Fosamax has been prescribed.
Yeah.
Is this okay with PBC?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've not talked about osteoporosis for quite a while, actually.
It's been a while. Yeah.
So when I've been in reflective mood. I've started saying lots of answers when I started in PBC in 1991. Robert is very familiar with that. And, you know, it's a sign of age. But it is really interesting, because I think we've been with the summit, we've been in a reflective mood. And, you know, 25 years of the foundation and so on. And, you know, this sort of changes in how we're going and all of those things. It makes us don't look backwards to be a slave, but look backwards to inform looking forwards. And there have been lots of young, you know, really cutting edge, bright, lovely clinicians in the meeting, which is great. So that's one of you've seen them in these meetings. There is a new generation of really bright PBC doctors coming through. They're the future. They're fabulous. They're all working with the foundation. It's great. But I've reminded them all that they were kind of, you know, in school when I started doing a PBC clinic, and therefore they've only seen PBC in recent years. And I remember seeing PBC back in the early 1990s before URSO came along. And one of the things we used to see all the time was fractures, really significant fractures, hip fractures and spine fractures. I remember a very lovely lady who had 8 or 9 major fractures. Okay. And we literally never see that anymore. And why do we not see that anymore? Well, I think there are 2 reasons. The first is I am convinced that URSO is part of the benefit. I think calcium absorption and vitamin D absorption from your diet is better in people who take URSO. I'm convinced about that I think URSO has made a difference to absorption and metabolism. People often worry about gaining weight with URSO, but the weight you're gaining is the weight you lost because you weren't absorbing things from the diet correctly. So it's not a reason to take URSO or not take URSO, whatever, but I just think that's a theory I've got. But the other one is that we have this approach of screening people for risk, okay? So we screen people with some personal factors. So PBC is associated with the risk of osteoporosis because of, we know that from our past experience, and it's because of vitamin D not being absorbed because of the bile acid thing I talked about before. So how do you screen people? We ask them about family history. because there's family history of osteoporosis, the risk is greater. Do people smoke? Smoking causes osteoporosis. Do people exercise? Because if you don't exercise much, the bones get weaker, and low body weight is a risk factor because the bones weaken. But we also do what's called bone mineral density scanning, which is DEXA scanning, which was mentioned, which is a form of X-ray, but rather than taking a picture, it measures the density of the bones. And all of that gets put into a formula called FRAX. And that gives us a percentage likelihood of a fracture, okay? And it recommends treatment. So it's one of these things, a bit like heart disease risk and statins, that there is an algorithm that people use. And if you really want to strengthen the bones, then Fosamax is a really good treatment, and we've used a whole load of it over the years. And I'm sure that also has contributed to the low fracture risk. Yeah. You really don't want a hip fracture or a back fracture. That's a pretty miserable thing to have happen. And thankfully, we never see any of those things. I think it's URSA, but I also think it's giving Fosamax in people who need it. But it's all well understood, and the process is all very much automated. But don't forget the importance of exercise and a good diet with plenty of calcium and vitamin D in it. So it's all.
Oh, Dave.
Fosamax is a good thing.
Okay, I've got you. You went quiet on me. Okay.
The one thing I wouldn't do, a lot of people talk about, you in the old days, you used to use HRT in women to prevent osteoporosis. We think HRT is very useful, the pros and cons, but for people to think about for controlling symptom burden. So I think it's part of contributing to making sure fatigue is minimized and brain fog is minimized. But we wouldn't tend to use it for osteoporosis prevention. There are better ways of doing that. Fosamax is one of them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
But it's one of the things that in my working lifetime has changed out of all recognition. And basically, for that reason, what we're doing seems to be pretty effective, doesn't it?
It would appear to be. So actually, I've got a number of questions coming in. I'm going to change the question slightly. And again, this is partly in reaction to some of the questions that have come in, but also to the summit chat. Here we are in 2023. So you remember the days when the standard of care was wait until people were ill enough to transplant. And then hopefully they got a transplant. And then also, and all the new stuff that we're working on, and the industry partners are working on new compounds that might well be available next year.
Yeah.
So PBC 2023 is a very, very different beast.
Yeah.
Now, when you're newly diagnosed, there is a degree of fear. There's a degree of shock.
Yeah.
It takes time to come to terms with what PBC means to you and how that. So, but my question is, if you were to do a 2-minute vox pop of what does PBC in 2023 mean? So, if you've been on the internet and you found 7 years, if you've been on the internet and you found that men do worse, if you've been on the internet and found that GP 210, all of these kind of things. So actually, if we had a 2-minute, you absolutely must watch this message if you're newly diagnosed with PBC.
Yeah.
What would it be?
So point number one is in 2023, newly diagnosed with early PBC, this is a completely controllable disease, completely controllable. And at the moment, it's not curable. We can't take it away, but we can control it completely. And we have a range of different treatments that we add in when we need to in order to make sure you control it. So to that newly presenting person, I would say be incredibly optimistic about the future, but be very careful about reading historic stuff because it relates to a different world and a different era. So newly presenting people, it has changed out of all recognition. Now, there are a range of treatments, and what you need to do is to find the right regime for an individual person. So there's a theme very much that came out of the summit about personalized medicine, that we need to adjust the regime to you as an individual, but work with your clinicians and own the problem in the sense that in this day and age, if you're young, you want to have normal blood tests. Okay, that's where you want to be. And there are a range of treatments now, and there are treatments coming that will allow you to do that in a way that works for you as an individual. Okay, so the really good news is the disease is controllable. The less good news is there is still work to do on symptoms, but we are doing that work. And I personally think that really effective control early will stop the symptoms from developing, but that's work in progress. And then the other problem area is late diagnosis and misdiagnosis. So the kind of good news for everybody on this call is that you've avoided the major problem in PBC, which is it not being diagnosed. And I think that's really, really, really important. And I'm just picking up on some of the questions in the chat about a young man with PBC, and a lot of worries about what this all means, and young, just diagnosed, and also with one of the autoantibodies called GP210. And the question is, what does this mean in terms of risk? And the important thing to say is that that yes, being a man changes PBC slightly. Being young certainly changes our perspective, because obviously you want 50 years out the liver if you're in your 30s. And GP210 antibodies over a large population are associated with a more aggressive disease. All of those things are true, but they are all controllable risks. So all that does is feed into the management model. So when we're making suggestions, and we always discuss it with people what the right treatments are, we're wondering whether it's going to be low treatment levels needed or maybe a little bit higher. All of those factors are fed into it. So they are all included in the thoughts regarding what you do to manage it. So with all of those things, this is still a completely controllable disease. My only caveat with that is that the more unusual it is, so being male is not the average, being 35 is not the average, being GP210 is not the average. The more unusual it is, then the more attention needs to be paid to it. And that's a sort of combination of things that I would expect to see in our clinic, that we would want to see people because there's a higher level of concern. It's a little bit more complicated. It's still very straightforward, but it's easy in that situation to kind of get it wrong. So one of the questions we asked is who should be seen by their GP, who should be seen by a local hospital, who should be seen in a specialist centre. A lot of it's common sense, but that's the sort of thing where we have clinics where we see people with those types of problems, and it would, I think, in that situation, be very reassuring. So there are centres around the country who are, experts at PBC. To be frank, even you don't need to get beyond 35. Actually, if you're 35, you probably should come to a specialist centre because you need to get this right for a lot of years. So there is nothing there that worries me at all. Shouldn't worry you. You should start ERSO and then pay close attention to the blood tests and things like that. And the foundation are very, very good on guiding people as to what you're looking for. But it's the sort of thing where you need to have somebody who's kind of into PBC and its nuances looking at all of that. So, and I think one of the big questions is how do we deliver care in an effective and equal way, and how do we use digital approaches? And one of the ideas that cropped up on the Medical Advisory Board, which I think is a fascinating one, is around a PBC MOT. So there's a balance between, in a sense, convenience of the local hospital, but maybe a lack of expertise versus distance and things like that. And I think one of the things that we do all the time is we do it on these calls, people run their experiences past us, the PBC experts, and sense check it. And actually 9 times out of 10, what's happening is fine. But maybe that's a good way to do it, is that we do there is a sort of an opportunity for getting a kind of virtual second opinion, looking at the blood tests and things like that. So I think that we're thinking about all of these ways. One thing that did change with COVID is that the idea that you have to physically go to your local hospital and wait in a waiting room, having struggled to park within 20 miles of where you live, has gone. Okay, and we all need to think about different ways of doing it. And I think if people come and get management from me, for example, in Newcastle, well, I guess there are two bits to it. 3 bits to it. There is my cheerful persona and all of that, Robert's looking horrified. There is the kind of general approach of positivity that we give with face-to-face meetings, which are very useful. But there's also the knowledge, okay? And most of all, actually, I mean, all of those are important, but actually it's the knowledge that's the important one, and ways to be able to spread all of that. So it's about how do you get the best care to the largest number of people. This is a good time to mention something that Robert and I and the foundation are working on that I think got very well received at the summit, is Project 9090. And Project 9090 is a 5-year vision to ensure that 90% of all people with PBC get 90% of perfect care. Okay, clearly it ought to be 100% for both, but let's say 90% as a realizable objective. We're not there at the moment. And so the question is, how do you make sure that happens, not for a few people in a good clinic, but for everybody? So, and that's about delivery awareness and all of those things. And to the gentleman who put these questions in about being young and male, most important thing is know what your alkaline phosphatase and bilirubin are, and know that you wish those to be normal. And if your doctor accepts those not being normal, then question that. And if they don't listen to you, change your doctor.
There we go. Thank you very much.
Because we're British and we tend to not want to upset the doctor. I didn't want to upset the doctor because they're a doctor. And, I say in the book, don't die of being too polite, right?
That's a great. Fall
in love with your inner American.
So no, that's, and having been at this summit, I think I can absolutely exemplify not being afraid to offend a doctor with questions. So I think it's absolutely vital that it's a part of
there's a question about how quickly you need to start ERSO, which I think is a very good follow-up point. Yeah, 2 months is fine. As soon as possible. We have a thing, we came up with this with COVID. What's first aid for PBC, if you like, because a lot of people couldn't get an appointment, therefore they weren't being diagnosed, therefore they weren't starting it. And, I think if it's going to be a delay, we would expect and hope GPs would start ERSO, but 2 months is fine.
Thank you. So I wasn't expecting a short answer, so I'm chewing ice now.
There you go. See, he's worked too long. He thought he could eat the ice because he wasn't getting a short answer. That's the first time he gets a short answer.
So, okay, so we've got a long, detailed question, and I think it's an important question because there's a bigger picture message. But again, I just want to remind people of the caveat that these Q&A sessions are not designed to give individual medical advice, but they're definitely absolutely all about general medical information. They don't replace your appointment with your consultant, but hopefully what they do is empower you to have the best possible conversation with your consultant the next time you see them. So with that all said, I was diagnosed in 2018, started taking ERSO at 750 milligrams.
Yeah.
Ursodiol. So we now know which country this person's in. Started taking cholestyramine for itch in June 22. Labs have been in the normal range since starting ERSO until March 23 when ALP went to 222.
Mm-hmm.
Labs were repeated in April, ALP 152.
Yeah.
Weight gain from 65 kilogram to 73 kilogram. Profound fatigue. So there's more concern for the patient than there seems to be for the physician.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, the patient questioned the ERSO dose because they've gained weight, and the PA said that wasn't necessary. So first off, and bear in mind, I'm not in the office at home, so I don't have all my materials around me. But how do we empower patients to have these kind of conversations? And is there a formula that describes what the best dose of ERSO?
Yeah. Okay. I was looking in my briefcase for the ERSO calculation. I have left it at home. So the first thing to say is that ERSO is the first line treatment for everybody, remains so, and you should absolutely do that. So, and it's important to take it at the right dose, which is 13 to 15 milligrams per kilogram. Okay. And the reason for that is it's some tablets are a fixed dose, some tablets are dose adjusted. So whatever your weight is now, you need to multiply by that by 13 and then 15. The reason there's a range is because obviously the tablets only come in a certain number of sizes. So you need to make a combination of tablets that is towards the higher end of that rather than the lower end of that. So that's the first thing to say. That's the kind of bedrock for everybody. So somebody whose LFTs, the ALP-FOS liver function test, was originally normal, that's great. If that's drifted off, then it's important just to sort of think about why that is. So why he's gone to get an URSO calculator. Robert, wave the URSO calculator. We did this just as a simple, easy way to work out what the correct dose is, okay? And as I said, just pick a dose that's tablets, confusingly and difficultly, the tablets come in 150, 250, 300 and 500 milligrams. So it's a case of a combination that is actually takeable. Okay, so ALP-FOS goes up after it's been stable. That's actually pretty unusual with PBC. So what you tend to do is reach a steady state and stick at all of that. So it went up to 220, that's a little bit high. And then it's come down to 150, which is kind of within the okay range, but not perfect. So what I want to do, so here I'm a bit like, I'm a bit of a detective when it comes to these things. So that's not a usual picture. So what I want to do is maybe repeat the ultrasound scan and make sure that there's nothing that's sort of changed in the liver. Is there a stone there that's maybe done, or is there some fat deposition in the liver because of the weight gain with the URSO? So that will be a reason why that's happened. Okay, so just repeat the liver function tests. I think if it's fatigue, then if you've got profound fatigue, then it's a case of working through the algorithm that we use for fatigue, and we've done a lot of stuff on that. Start with, do you have any itch? Treating that. Look for the other causes of fatigue that might have developed, such as thyroid disease or anemia. With a weight gain, it's possible it's diabetes. So look for all of those things and treat them. It's amazing how often you find them. And the next level is around looking for those factors that make fatigue worse in PBC. So sleep disturbance is one. Poor blood pressure regulation is another. Depression can be another one. So there's a very much a fixed process that we go through with it all. So it needs a little bit of a workup, but it isn't usual to get good control of that and to slip off. And so it's probably just worth an additional look. But everyone should get their URSO dose optimized.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. See, the system works. We managed to get a dose calculator, which is great. Right, I have another question for you. Mm-hmm. I have compensated cirrhosis from PBC. Yeah. Last month, I had a gastrointestinal hemorrhage with slight stomach ache. Admitted onto hospital on antibiotics, and doctor mentioned colitis on the left side only. What does that mean?
Okay, so let's take that in turn. So what's cirrhosis? So cirrhosis is the state where you have scarring in the liver, and that scarring links up what are called the portal tracts, which are the bits with the artery, the blood vessels, and the bile duct. So it's like a network of fibrosis, of scarring. Okay, and you've also then got the liver regenerating itself, trying to cope with all of that, and that can put some pressure on the liver cells because they're trying to grow within a network. It's a bit like bubble wrap. It's a network of these kind of bubbles of liver cells, but surrounded by harder tissue. So that's what cirrhosis is. There are about 110 different causes of cirrhosis. Everyone assumes it's alcohol. That was a problem for PBC patients. That was why the name changed. And in fact, most people didn't have cirrhosis anyway. So that's the history of all of that. But PBC is just one of the causes of cirrhosis. Okay. And what we're trying to do with treatment in this day and age, new therapies and all of that, is stop people getting cirrhosis. So that's the goal. Once people have got cirrhosis, it's still very important to control the disease to prevent the risk of it getting worse. So it doesn't change your desire to treat the disease, but it changes what you can use and how you use them. So it all becomes a little bit individualized again. So that's what cirrhosis is. What does compensated mean? So basically, that's the extent to which the liver is coping with it. So is the liver managing to cope with this, or is the liver not managing to cope with this? Okay. Now, essentially, compensated cirrhosis indicates that the liver is working fine. It's doing what it needs to do. And that's important because that's a very stable state, and people, can live problem-free with that for many, many, many years. So that's good. So gastrointestinal hemorrhage, there are lots of reasons why you bleed into the gut. Some of them related to liver disease, some of them not. There's an old saying that the commonest cause of people bleeding into their gut who don't have cirrhosis is an ulcer. And the commonest cause of people bleeding into their gut who do have cirrhosis is still an ulcer. So people tend to assume that it's things like varices, which are blood vessels developing in the bowel because people have got cirrhosis. But it needs to be investigated, needs an endoscopy and managed appropriately. So it's something that happens. Don't worry about it. Don't panic. It's a very manageable thing, but it does mean that there needs to be a step up in the management, focus on detail with the PBC. Okay. Now, left-sided colitis. So colitis, inflammation in the colon. And you can get colitis for a variety of reasons. Now, everyone thinks when they use the term colitis, they think of ulcerative colitis, which is a form of what we call inflammatory bowel disease, a bit like an autoimmune condition that affects the gut. It is not associated with PBC. It is associated with PSC, though. So in my detective hat, I always, if somebody had colitis with quotes PBC, I'd go back to their antibody status and be absolutely sure they did in fact have PBC and not PSC, because that's a mistake that people can make. So my detective bit would say, let's check on that. The other reasons why people can get colitis is to do with antibiotics. You can get it after antibiotics as part of what's called C. diff. People have heard of that, which is an infection you get when you've had antibiotics. The other possibility is as a consequence of having antibiotics. It's if you've definitely got PBC, then it's not linked to the PBC and it's not linked to the bleed. And then it just, people will kind of try and conflate those things, but you just need to work through all of those. So the colitis left side usually doesn't need any treatment or just enemas or something of that order. But you do need to have a workup for the PBC to work on risk reduction. So if you've got varices in your gullet, then you probably need to be on beta blockers in order to reduce the risk of it all. Okay. I'll just tell you with my detective hat is many people will be familiar with the TV program House. Okay. The doctor who detects all these weird diseases. It was Hugh Laurie played House on American television. And it was a great thing. It was about an English doctor being this sort of genius at diagnosing people. But of course, it's an in-joke, okay? Because it was based on Sherlock Holmes, this detecting and deducing. And of course, what is your house if it's not a home, right? So that's the joke.
Okay, cool. I thought you were going to say Colombo. So, okay.
That's an obscure fact for people.
All right, thank you.
Holmes, and the name is a joke.
There you go. Right, I've got a question for you, which arrived in Facebook in Spanish.
Yes, no, I saw it.
So I've actually translated. So this is why we use Click Meeting.
Yeah.
So I've now translated the question into English. I'm going to read it to you in English. I'm going to ask you to speak slowly because I'm going to type your answer, and then I'm going to type the answer, translate it to Spanish, and then put it up on Facebook.
Yes.
2023 in PBC Care. It's just amazing.
Okay.
Right. So this is the literal translation, so it's not perfect, but why have I lost my right kidney and my urinary bladder after 20 years of stable taking Urso? I wear a shunt to lower portal pressure to perform the urostomy. My current problem is my vision, which is a bit cloudy and affects my way of moving and feeling safe when walking. Any relationship with PBC?
So the kidney disease and the ureter disease is not linked to PBC. Okay. those are unrelated. However, the operation around that, we talked about compensated cirrhosis, but operations, anesthetics can decompensate, and you can also bleed. So they will have done the shunt to make the surgery safe. But the need for the surgery isn't related to PBC. The PBC is a potential complication.
So bear with me.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, Joe. I'm online live, Joe, so I'll come back to you if that's okay. So I've actually, Joe, who is the guy at the hotel who put everything in place for the summit, he's just walked in the room and he's absolute legend. So there you go. Right. So I've got that precaution from complications. Okay, thank you. So I will edit that and put that in Spanish and do all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And again, just amazing. Right, we will get that done for you. So here is rheumatoid arthritis. What can you take that isn't going to affect the liver?
So that's a really good question. Really good question. So PBC is an autoimmune disease, so it's an immune system problem, and so we therefore see an increased incidence of other immune problems in people with PBC. Okay, and obviously we see a lot of thyroid disease, we see a lot of arthritis, we see a lot of pernicious anemia. So we see some people with rheumatoid arthritis, not a huge number, but rheumatoid arthritis and PBC is something that we see. And because of the association, I have lots of patients who I jointly manage with my rheumatology colleagues, and the joint management is about finding the right treatment regime for both conditions. So what you don't want is a condition that makes one of the diseases worse whilst improving the other. So you're finding a good common ground. Now, the good news is that there is almost nothing that you can't take for rheumatoid arthritis because you've got PBC. So that's the important first thing to say. In terms of simple analgesics and anti-inflammatories, they're fine in PBC. People worry about paracetamol because of liver injury, but that's only an overdose, remember. So you don't need to be worried about that. And things like brufen, people say you can't take them in PBC. I don't know where that comes from. We tell people to do it. Now, in terms of other additional treatments, they really split into two types. So one is the kind of tablet anti-inflammatory, higher level anti-inflammatories, hydroxychloroquine. A lot of people take. We don't have any problems with that. A common one is methotrexate, and people often worry about methotrexate in liver disease because it can cause liver scarring. And again, methotrexate has been trialed in PBC and it doesn't cause any worsening. It's a little bit of an old-fashioned drug, but people sometimes use it. So methotrexate and side effects in liver disease patients is something that's more kind of thought about and worried about than is real, if you know what I mean. So they're all fine. And then, of course, you've got what are called the biologicals. So these are the whizzy new drugs that really alter the immune system. And this is where I think it gets really interesting, because almost all of those drugs are ones we would also like to try in PBC. So rituximab is one that's commonly used in rheumatoid arthritis. We use it in PBC. We've done a trial of it in PBC. In our trial, it was mainly about symptoms, but everybody who took it, their liver function test normalized. So that is safe and is effective in PBC. Anti-TNF, there's not much infliximab, for example, they've not really been trialed in PBC, but there's no theoretical reason why they were problematic. And then some of the other drugs like ustekinumab, again, have been trialed in PBC, maybe not effective in PBC, but certainly no harm with it. So I think you're pretty safe actually on most of those things. You need to see your individual tests and things like that. But I would say whatever you need to do for the rheumatoid arthritis, the treatments they would use, unless they're going to use something really weird and new, would either do nothing for the PBC or would tend to improve it. So what I wouldn't do is pull the punches on the rheumatoid arthritis management. So it's a really quite straightforward situation, that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we've just had a comment from a first-time listener. And again,
Hello.
and when I was faffing with the technology and not being very successful with it, I noticed we had people from Australia, Europe, and US all on at the same time again. So thank you, welcome. And this is just part of the service that we offer here at the foundation. Another cracking question for you, Dave.
Yep.
Please explain how muscle pain is a symptom. I've had issues with arm pain, brackets muscle, 4 years prior to my new diagnosis, which happened 2 months ago. And you'll be stunned to hear they get heavy and ache terribly.
Okay. So, a great question. How long have we got? I'm okay to about 2:30 is the answer you haven't.
So to be honest, I'm probably about 1:15 if that's just because of everything that's going on. So apologies.
So for anybody who's new today, we couldn't get the normal host, and so we had to make do with the Saturday boy who can't work the technology. So just apologies. You know, there's at least one professional on this call. It's not true. It's not.
There
true.
is.
Yeah. Okay. Really good question. Muscle pain. So people often talk about aching arms and legs. So the first question we always ask is it muscle, or is it bone, or is it joints, or is it combinations of those? So that's actually the first and important question. It can be quite difficult, but people are usually okay with that, and it's quite important to be able to tell the difference. This allows me to tell you my old joke, which is we love our surgical colleagues very dearly, but we do tell surgeon jokes. And one of my jokes is, what's the definition of a holistic orthopedic surgeon? And the answer is, it's somebody who's interested in the whole bone and not just the joint. I'm hoping there are no orthopedic surgeons on the call. If it's muscle pain, that's very characteristic of PBC, very characteristic. And it's one of those symptoms that gets neglected. So there are some symptoms that people just don't pick up on. But it's in the PBC 40, which is very interesting because it came up in those conversations with people. Now, the first and simplest question is, anybody who gets new onset muscle pain, have they started taking either a statin or fibrates? And those of you who read the papers, they'll know there's a lot of debate. Do these drugs cause muscle pain? Right. I can tell you they cause muscle pain in some people. There is no debate. We see this in people all the time. I take statin, I've got muscle pain, right? I know the public health people would tell me I'm imagining it, but I'm not. So just you rein back the dose if that happens, and they check the blood. So that's a caveat to all of that. So why do PBC patients get muscle pain? They do get muscle pain. It's part of fatigue, and it's to do with metabolism. So in simple terms, all of us take sugar in its various different forms in the diet, and we burn it in one way or another. And there are different ways for the body to burn it. And when it gets burned, in simple terms, you produce carbon dioxide, which you breathe out, and water. So sugar gets converted into energy, carbon dioxide, and water. There are two extreme forms to it. One is, and I use a sports analogy for this. So one of them would be a marathon runner, a top marathon runner, right? And these people can keep going hour after hour after hour. They do super marathons. They do a marathon and then a marathon back again. And the point is, they have a steady state of metabolism where they burn exactly the same amount of sugar for exactly the oxygen they take in. And so basically they are like a kind of a fuel cell that just turns over exactly the same amount. Okay. Now, the other type of metabolism is, think not of a marathon runner, but of a sprinter. A top sprinter does 100 meters. They don't even breathe during 100 meters. There's no point. And what they do is consume a vast amount of energy, vastly more than the marathon runner. They go much faster than the marathon runner, but at the end of the 100 meters, they're collapsing on the track, panting away. And what's happened in those people is that they have burnt the sugar in a different way. Rather than this steady state kind of generator, they've burnt it, they've converted it all into lactic acid. That generates a huge amount of energy, doesn't need any oxygen, but your lactic acid will build up and you cannot continue. That's why they can't do 400 meters. A top 100, 200 meters will not be able to do a 400 meter race because they're just designed to do this huge burn. And that lactic acid makes the muscles painful, makes them ache. People just feel washed out. Now, for reasons that we're trying to understand, PBC patients behave like sprinters. So your metabolism is very like that. You are overproducing lactic acid rather than steady state generation. And we've done a lot of MR. There may be people on from Newcastle who are involved in some of the studies going MR scanner to measure energetics. You can actually measure people's pH in their muscles. You can see this happening. So we put people in a scanner just over here. And we got them to exercise for a few minutes at 35% of the maximum they could do. So that's enough to just notice you're doing it, but not much more. So you're going to be able to do that all day long normally. And we saw normal individuals who did this, that the pH in their muscle dropped a little bit, so they were getting a little more acidotic, but then they just hit a steady state plateau and it continued like that for as long as they wanted to do it. We stopped the study because everyone got very bored just carrying on like that. PBC patients, their pH would plummet to levels that you would expect to see after a sprinter had done a race. So it's a very real phenomenon. This is not just something we've made up. You have this real weird abnormality in metabolism. Okay. So why does that happen? We don't know. Interestingly, the enzyme, the protein in cells that switches from one type of metabolism to the other is a thing called pyruvate dehydrogenase. And that is what the AMA that are diagnostic of PBC react with. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because there's some connection going on there. We haven't quite fathomed what it does. Now, what does that tendency to behave like a sprinter mean to you as an individual with your muscle pain and fatigue? So the first thing is, this is why exercise is helpful, okay? And it's not naggy doctor says you should exercise because exercise is good for you. The sprinter gets to be able to sprint more by training because that increases the number of ways that the cell can help with lactic acid. So it can kick lactic acid out into the blood. So when you exercise, you build up transporters to get rid of lactic acid. Exercise clearly works in PBC. There's a trial going to come out showing that it works. The Foundation are all over this with movement as medicine, and there's an absolute biological basis for it. Okay, so that's why exercise helps with fatigue, and it will help with muscle pain as well. Now, people will often say, that's great, but how on earth do I get started because I'm really tired? And here's a little trick which is worth thinking about, which is a vitamin called coenzyme Q10, which a number of people on the call I'm sure are familiar with. So we did a trial of coenzyme Q10 a number of years ago, and a number of people with PBC fatigue get real benefit from it. But those same sprinters will use coenzyme Q10 to help themselves train because it makes energy generation in your muscles about 10% more efficient. So coenzyme Q10, you can buy it from any supermarket and get it online. It's a vitamin, it's not a drug. You know, it's a food supplement basically, but it will not cure your fatigue and it will not cure your muscle pain, but it will make it a little bit better and it will help you to exercise, which is the real way of making it better. Just remember, basically, you need to find a way of being able to cope with the acid in the muscle much more. But there is a, you know, we sometimes hear, and one of the things I think was very good about the summit is that Robert will know the depressing extent to which for years and years and years, quotes experts would belittle symptoms and say how they're not important. And I sometimes felt with Colette and Robert, you know, the lone voice arguing for patients. And that seems to have stopped now. That seems to have stopped, and people accept the reality of these problems. Yeah. But you've got to accept the reality in order to then think you should research them and work out what to do. And that's why I think there's this real future direction of symptoms trials, but very, very muscly fatigue, feels like the batteries are run down, feel like you've run a half marathon. Make sure you drink plenty of fluid because that washes the lactic acid out. Try and do a little bit more exercise and it will help with it, and think about coenzyme Q10.
Wonderful. Thank you. So actually, funnily enough, I was going to save this as the last one, but we've brought it up. So the question is, any tips on fatigue?
Yes. So, very surreally, I went, ooh, because I'd just been attacked by a stuffed rabbit, which sits on my computer. Okay. Robert, you know your problem with hallucinations. If you see a white rabbit on the camera, it's that problem cropping up again. Okay. So I'm sure nobody else can see a rabbit, can they? It's Robert's problem. Right. Tips on fatigue. So the first thing is it's real, okay? And don't listen to people who say it isn't, it's all in your mind, and tell you they were tired because they went working at the weekend and all of those things. So A, it's real, and B, there are plenty of other people like you, and so don't feel that you're the only person with it. Okay, so that's tip number one. So tip number two is to kind of share it with other people, because it's real, family members, work colleagues, things like that, it doesn't look, I'm sure everybody with fatigue is fed up with being told how well they look. That doesn't help you, does it now? But it's just useful to share it, particularly with partners and things, to kind of get them to understand it. So that's the second thing. The third thing is to just ask yourself the question, which of the following or both is it? So there are two sorts of fatigue in PBC. And this is partly a problem with the word, because fatigue means different things to different people. It's really one of the problems in the field. So there is a sort of muscly, powery energy fatigue. And the classic thing people say with that is their batteries have run down. And that's often where people get muscle ache, as we've just discussed. So does it feel like the batteries have run down? And then the other one is a brainy, concentrate-y, mentally type of fatigue, where people often talk about brain fog. Okay, so we use the term batteries running down and brain fog because they're words that people use. So sometimes people can have one, sometimes people can have the other, sometimes people can have both. Now, I told you about exercise and coenzyme Q10. That particularly works for the peripheral muscly type of fatigue. So, and then there are slightly different things to think about with the kind of brainy centrally one. So tips. So the first thing is, fundamentally, these are all about energy. Okay, we've talked about energy a lot. So the first thing to do is to treat energy like a valuable resource. Okay, so treat it like your money in your bank account. Spend it wisely. So use the energy that you have to do the things that you want to do, and just accept that if you've kind of run out of money for the day, you don't spend any more. So listen to your body in that regard. So the second thing is pace your day, pace yourself. So typically in PBC, the fatigue is a lot better in the morning, and people run out of energy during the day. And so often, they end up having a sleep. So that's normal. So, arrange your day accordingly. So if you've got an important meeting, do it in the morning. If you've got to go and, do something, try and do it in the morning. If your employer is making you work shifts, ask them if you can adjust your working hour. I can tell you, I said it at the summit, amongst the most effective interventions I've done for fatigue is to get people to no longer have to do night shifts. Yeah. I know a cabin crew member on a long haul airline, and time shifts play utter havoc with her fatigue. So a routine that allows you to use your energy at the times you feel best is a very good thing. And if you do have a quieter day, don't worry about it. It will be better again tomorrow. It's not a slippery slope. So, pace yourself around all of those things. Sleep is really important with this. So we do see a lot of sleep problems. So having a chat about potential ways to make sure you're not struggling with sleep, and don't do what British people do, which I think is, British people do some mad things, and this is one of them, is that you're awake at night, so you go downstairs and have a cup of tea. tea keeps you awake. It's the worst thing you could do. So think about what time you're going to bed. Think about not taking coffee or tea or Red Bull, in the afternoon and evening, and that will help with your sleep. But the biggest piece of advice is own the problem, own the solution. We talk about this all the time. You can live a much better life with all of this, but you do need to work out the things that work for you. And we're working on a thing that we call My 3 Steps, which is really just a pathway to have a dialogue about the things you're going to do to take control of this. Maybe it's walk the dog 5 times a day because exercise is good, or maybe this is, speaking to the boss about rearranging your working patterns. But own the problem and own the solution, because it's your life. You need to find a way through it. So that ownership is a very important thing. So they would be my top tips.
Perfect. Thank you. Last question. Now, just for context, I am aware, so I know that this patient who's asking this question is someone who experiences extreme itch. So that's the context behind this question. Okay. That said, I've lost the question. So somebody's been put on fibrates. PBC, underactive thyroid, kidney disease. When I read the leaflets for bezafibrate, it worries me that I shouldn't be on them, because it says not to take with kidney disease and thyroid.
Yeah.
They also take a statin. But what is the concern between the tablet and these conditions?
Okay, so bezafibrate is increasingly used for 2 reasons in PBC. One is as a disease-controlling tablet, as an alternative to a beta-cholic acid. And then the other is a way of controlling itch. And clearly in people who need better disease control, a beta-cholic acid can cause itch, and so therefore that's something we tend to stay away from. So those are the 2 settings in which we use it. So of those 2, one of them is a problem and one of them isn't. So thyroid is not an issue I've ever come across, and I wouldn't particularly be concerned at all with regard to thyroid disease, and largely because you're going to monitor thyroid function in PBC patients anyway. So if bezafibrate is the right treatment, then I wouldn't be cautious about it from a thyroid perspective. Okay, renal is very different. So bezafibrate causes renal problems. It makes your kidney function worse. What happens is that you can end up with kidney dysfunction, and if you stay on the same dose of bezafibrate, it builds up and it makes it worse and worse and worse. So the big problem with bezafibrate is kidney function. About 1 in 10 people in our clinic who take bezafibrate have kidney problems, one sort or another. I think it's going to be a major issue with where we go with bezafibrate moving forward. So what do you do? So the first thing to say is that it's worse with what's called the sustained release version. So 400 milligrams once a day is the dose we tend to use in people normally, and that's the one that causes renal problems. So you can move to a non-single once a day. So it's the sustained release issue that's the problem. So perhaps talk to your doctor about moving to bezafibrate given in a slightly different way, or reducing the dose. Okay. Doctor will measure a thing called the EGFR, the estimated glomerular filtration rate, which is a blood test of kidney function. And there are cutoffs below which I sort of absolutely wouldn't use bezafibrate in anybody. 50 is the cutoff for those who know those numbers. So just this should be looked at, but you really need to not take it. The question then becomes, why are you taking it? Because if it's for disease modification and you absolutely can't take OCA because of intractable itch, then that's something you might want to ride, but it's going to be watched very carefully. If it's for itch control, then there are frankly better ways of controlling the itch that don't give you kidney problems. And I think if you have intractable itch, if somebody's got intractable itch, I wouldn't use bezafibrate anyway, because it's not that great as an itch treatment. It's a little bit oversold. You'll read a lot about it on the internet. It's a little bit oversold. We have a specialist symptoms clinic Okay, so we know all about this stuff. So we would tend to use other drugs, and I think certainly if you're getting renal impairment, I would look to go somewhere else. And if you wanted disease control, you've got bad itch, then I would look to control the itch with rifampicin or gabapentin or something like that, and then look at see if you can add in a beta-cholic acid that doesn't cause all of those problems. So bezafibrate is flavor of the month, and it has use in PBC, but it isn't the answer to PBC in the same way as the beta-cholic acid isn't, and urso certainly isn't. They're all part of the option set. If you've got intractable itch and you're taking bezafibrate and you're getting renal impairment with it, that is another of the scenarios, a little bit like the younger man that we talked about earlier, where you need to have this looked after by somebody who knows what they're doing with it. And so there are plenty of centres around the country who'd be very, very capable of managing that, but it's not the one for somebody who manages a sort of handful of PBC patients to be looking after, because it's a bit complicated. Yeah. It's easy to manage, sort of thing that wouldn't worry a PBC expert at all, but you do have to individualize it to you and to weigh up the pros and cons and things. So it's a sort of one where I don't know where you're being looked after, but it needs to be somebody who kind of knows. You'd agree with that, Robert?
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah.
So great question, great answer, and personalized medicine. Who knew?
Yeah.
So wonderful. All right, Dave, thank you so much. I'm very much aware of time.
Mr. Rabbit and I need to leave.
I didn't see a rabbit. Is there a rabbit? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of close the conversation. So I'm going to close off on trained professionals. Right, I'm going to close off on Facebook. So thank you very much for joining us today. Some great comments. The community welcoming the new people and all that kind of thing is wonderful. So thank you very much for doing that, and we'll see you again soon.